originally in line with this idea of elite politics, or rather that politics is reserved for the elites, the founding fathers, elites themselves, determined that that those that were eligible for voting were property owners. In other words, males could vote, specifically property owning males. So if that you were a person of color, a woman, obviously a minor, a recent immigrant that hadn't naturalized, and therefore have not, a specific immigrant, I'm sorry, not all immigrants were eligible for property ownership under the 1791, I believe, Nationalization Immigration Act. So you had to be a very specific type of European in order to be naturalized, a specific type of European in order to own property, and therefore you had to be a certain European background in order to vote. So it wasn't until the 15th Amendment that African Americans and then later other people groups were able to vote as a result of the 15th Amendment. Literacy tests and poll tests were also used by regions, by states, and by counties in order to limit who could vote. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 did away with the literacy test. You no longer had to be able to prove that you could read in order to vote. And the 24th Amendment did away with the poll taxes. Both of these, literacy tests and poll taxes, obviously were trying to keep poor people and uneducated people from exercising their right to vote. Voting rights expansions later continued with the 19th Amendment offering women the suffrage and offering women the ability to vote in the 1920s. And then the age limit was set at 18 with the 26th Amendment. Registration requirements were also set in 1993 by the Motor Voter Law. Now, elections and actual voter turnout really are really influenced by various factors. One is the political culture of the state, of the region itself. The other is the election type. Presidential cycles often have a greater voter turnout than mid-elections or local elections. Demographics, as I stated earlier, the older you are, the more educated, the higher income you have, you're more likely to vote. The opposite is true for lower turnout. And party competition. People like to come out to vote when there's competitive races. If you study political science for any length of time, you will really begin to understand, or rather to become aware that progressivism was so influential in the way that our political system has been influenced and framed. Progressivism was not so much a party or an organized movement or even a period or an era. It was really an organized movement of a general spirit of reform that initiated in the early 1900s as a result of the Industrial Revolution, and it went on roughly till about 1920s. This was a group of people who believed that Americans needed reforms within their private and public sectors. These were Americans with diverse goals and backgrounds. These were people who embraced pluralism and understood that competition within the populace was good and necessary and should be heard by policymakers. During this progressive movement, several progressive political reforms were instituted that we still have today that were very, very instrumental in changing the way that people access their democracy. One is the initiative process. This was a procedure whereby ordinary citizens can propose laws for consideration by their state or to the voters directly. The state of California uses initiative processes. Initiatives are citizen-led. They start off by petitions, and they are put on the ballot for voters to vote on them directly. They bypass the legislature completely. Referendums, a procedure whereby citizens could vote directly on whether or not to approve a proposed law. This is a law that is initiated by the legislature, but then the state's citizens vote on whether or not they will put these in the books, in the law books for the state. The recall is a procedure by which a public official is removed from office directly from a vote. The state of California has used their recall in removing Governor Gray Davis and opening it up to an out-of-season election whereby former actor Arnold Schwarzenegger was voted as governor of California. Progressives really felt like they were pushing back against what had become a very elitist, very opportunistic political way of doing government. Elected officials were bringing in their family members, their friends. They were returning favors and putting people in office. They were bullying delegates to vote for their nominee in order for them to get elected. There was a lot of backroom deals and conventions. And so the progressives really were instituting reforms so that it would be more democratic. One of those reforms was the secret ballot. It's the procedure by which citizens could keep their votes a secret. Often, many civil servants working within the government were bullied into voting for the person or the reforms, or the proposals that their boss perhaps wanted them to vote for. So to avoid that, the secret ballot was initiated. Also the direct primary, which is a procedure whereby political party nominations for public office are made directly by a vote of rank and file members of the party rather than by the party bosses. This is where we get the delegates from. This is where we get superdelegates from. Eventually we became superdelegates, but this is where we got some of these state delegates, where people of the party within states elect appoint various delegates to vote on their behalf. The direct election of U.S. senators was also instituted during this time. It's a procedure to allow the citizens in each state to directly elect for the senators, and this was provided by the 17th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution in 1913. The women's suffrage also came during this progressive movement. They granted the women the right to vote through the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. These are all things that happened under the progressive movement, and these are all reforms that are still very valuable today. There were some administrative reforms that were aimed at not at minimizing corruption within civil servants, within departments, within cabinetries, within local governments, but also to maximize efficiency. Part of this movement was to find elite professional administrators. Now, this is counterintuitive to this whole ideal of pluralism, but what they mean by elite is that they instituted a way for people to become civil servants because based on their skills, based on their education. People were being hired off the streets based on their ability and their skill to apply for a job based on their merit. And this is where we get the city manager system. Within cities, you have the elected officials, you have council members, you might have a mayor who is either elected directly by the citizens of a city or possibly elected within the council. But the city manager is a skilled administrator who then hires other skilled administrators to do the professional work for the city. And this is something that came out of a need for efficiency and fairness within the workings of civil government. The centralization of decision-making process also came in through this time of decisions made not for political reasons, but for efficiency reasons. These were all movements to eliminate government corruption, as I mentioned earlier, and to maximize efficiency. Another purpose for the regulation, these progressive regulations, were really to regulate these large corporations and to minimize monopolies, to minimize this whole laissez-faire type of capitalism that was very rampant during the industrial age, to really break up some of these large trusts and these large organizations that were taking on, they were buying out smaller companies to minimize competition. Also, to regulate big industry, to bring fair regulation and employment regulations, to really get children out of the workplace, to set the age of the minimum age of employees. This is also a time where education became more of a priority. Education became free. There was a push towards education being now mandatory and high school becoming mandatory, and regulating work hours, for example, instituting mandatory breaks, instituting mandatory fire escapes and mandatory evacuation. The idea of, the whole regulation of being in a workplace where you can't be locked in the event of a fire. So many of these regulations were necessary because it was really so unregulated and during the industrial age. Also during this time was a big push for socialism, and during this time also having more fair practices, fair wages. The increase of labor unions during this time really minimized the movement towards socialism that was starting to rise during this during the 1800s and the 1900s, the early part of the 1900s. We also saw a push for government intervention in social justice matters. This was during this time we developed professional social workers to care for the needy, the widow, the children, the orphans. This was also a time where we built settlement houses for homeless, for at-risk youth. We enacted child labor laws, as I mentioned in the previous slide. We supported goals for organized labor unions and prohibition laws. This was also during the time where the more moralistic laws were put into place, where prohibition became the law of the land. And this was really in response to domestic violence, vagrancy, and some of the social ills that were becoming very rampant in some of these high density cities as a result to what was blamed on alcohol. And so to combat some of these social ills within homes and within cities, we attempted to prohibit the use or limit the use of alcohol.